We've got all Year 12 squads today. I don't think any of the younger years fancied such a interesting yet controversial topic. Now, what I wanted to start with is we kind of rushed the end, I think, in the last episode, kind of post World War II. So I want to kind of drop us in there. So, what were the kind of claims? How did World War II change the case for partition? And what were the kind of, well, I want to get onto the Irgun Acts as well. So if anyone wanted to talk about those two. Tom?
Well, I think firstly the main effect that World War II had was its effect on the British. So World War II fundamentally shattered any hopes of continuing the British Empire, firstly through the American view on empire and also through the shattered British resources. I mean, Britain was now facing conflicts on the home front and also an upcoming conflict with the Cold War. So this gave the British public especially a very negative view towards intervening in the Middle East, and also made them very pro-submitting their mandate to the United Nations.
And of course, I think it's clear to say that where Britain left, America kind of filled the gap in that, of course, America was being a successor of the Second World War, and now they could, in addition, with that Cold War bubbling, they could start to, move out of that isolationism that dominated before the war to a more global focus. So, of course, Britain's more focused on its mess in its colonies.
To just alight upon Britain once more, and one of the most significant acts of the Irgun. On the 22nd of July 1946, explosives in the King David Hotel would claim the lives of 91 people in a figure that was later adjusted to 92, which really was one of the most significant events within the Middle East, as this massively worsened relations between the British and the Yishuv, which was the Jewish community, and Israel. But this was really the time when Britain fully recognised that they were unable to run its mandate in Palestine for much longer, and this would allow the moderates within Palestine to exercise more control, as well as harden the resolve to give it over to the UN, really recognising Hashem's point.
Yes, it really did, and of course we have to also kind of get onto, as Hashim mentioned, the American influence. Now, Truman was president of the United States at the time, and he was very pro-Zionist, not least because of what he saw in the Holocaust and his obvious sympathy for the Jews afterwards, especially since after the Holocaust, in the kind of immediate aftermath, there were many displaced people who, even after the liberation of the camps, because they essentially had nowhere left to go to, they kind of just had to stay in the camps, and Truman was just disgusted by this having to happen. So as a result, he pressured the British government massively to allow, I believe, 100,000 more Jews in. Now, Ernest Bevin, who was Foreign Secretary at the time, was very opposed to this, because he's very much viewed as a hard pragmatist. But the thing you have to understand at the time between the relationship of America and the United Kingdom is Marshall Aid. Now, America was supplying lots of Marshall Aid to the United Kingdom because the government feared that the poverty after World War II would lead to some kind of communist revolt, which they were very much against, especially in the Cold War climate. Now, this is something we also have to take into account when we understand American influence. But does anyone want to talk about it, especially with regards to Truman or perhaps the Jewish lobbying movement in America or any of those other things?
Yeah, so of course after the war, of course under the Marshall Plan, America really starts to expand its very much outward-looking ideas, first and foremost with Europe, through economic aid, and this then of course grows even further out, of course, to the real issues of the Second World War, these ideas of genocide, these claims, of course, of cultural destruction, and of course the Jewish lobby being, as we did in the previous podcast, we already alighted on their significant role in America. This, of course, after the war is only further increased, and we see that actually they see the Jewish issue very much focused. It now becomes very heavily focused on finding a home and finding a safe area for the Jews, that they had not found in Europe. It very much comes within the Middle East policies, at this point, very destroyed region, very under such, this region being under such, tensions and areas, with the collapse of empires, the Jewish issue for many Americans and for government goes right to the top.
Yeah, I mean, something that often stems from this, which a lot of people view as anti-Semitic, is this idea when we talk about Jewish lobby, is this kind of anti-Semitic trope that the Jews have this control over the American government. But simply, I'd like to point out that's just how American democracy works. I mean, to raise an issue with the American government, you do that through lobbying. Now, the three Jewish lobbies that were the main ones at the time were the Jewish Agency, led by, it was founded by Weizmann, I believe, the American Zionist Emergency Council, and the American Jewish Committee. Now, the things that Truman did as a result of lobbying, but also, like I said, his sympathy with the Jews for the broader issue of the Holocaust, were things like setting up the Anglo-American Committee to try and figure out a solution to the problem of Jews in Palestine. He also criticised the British government for taking too much time to implement solutions, and also lobbied nations in the UN to pass Resolution 181 in November 1947, which we will get onto very shortly. But I wanted to talk again about what Leo said about the Irgun and the attacks on the King David Hotel. Now, there's kind of historical amnesia about these at the moment in Israel. For example, there's this narrative that's often been pushed about a kind of justification of those attacks, saying, well, you know, the British were warned by the Irgun in advance, and quote unquote, for reasons only known to the British, they stayed in the hotel. But of course, you know, through a modern lens, and through a modern lens, especially a British modern lens, we can't really see a warning as simply justifying a terrorist act such as that. But does anyone want to talk about UNSCOP or the UN Resolution 181? Ibrahim?
Well, a little bit of background on how this worked is, well, what will become the Israelis, the Jews had a much stronger, organised and structured lobbying platform which they could use in the UN compared to the Arabs. The Arabs hadn't really been in the international community as integrated as the Jews were. So when it came to talking about this partition, they had an advantage. Now, most delegates in the UN believed in our partition plan, and it said 2 years you'd have it partitioned to an Arab and Jewish state with Jerusalem under the international committee. The thing is, the Jews would actually receive more land than the Israelis, even though
the Arabs.
Than the Arabs. Even though Jews only controlled 10% of the land in the region, and Jews only made up 30% or a third of the population. But
55% of the land.
55% of the land. So you can see that disparity there, and why the Arabs were more resistant to it. However, you'll see later that it doesn't work out in their favour. But because of that position of being, you know, non-accommodationist towards the Jews, it sort of hurt them in the long run. But you can see why they would not be very happy with this proposal.
Yeah, I mean, just to add a bit of context to those statistics, even the 55% of land, although it's disproportionate to the population, a lot of that land was pretty useless. I mean, it was the Negev Desert, which is completely unfarmable land that was given to the Jews. Tom?
Yeah, I'd just like to, on Ibrahim's point, I mean, the whole Arab policy was essentially a religious policy, and in essence, it has to be absolutist, which is why you get a complete kind of lack of any sort of bureaucratic elegance when they are trying to negotiate an UNSCOP, and that's why they refuse to participate, which is why they're kind of obliterated in the political theatre by Israel, or the Israeli state.
Yeah, and I think it's just a general bit of more localism from the Arabs. Of course, as we said, the Jews having been expelled from Israel, they'd been forced to real deal being on the world. Many Jews had left America. They'd made roots. Although when they did that, they weren't aiming to build political roots. They had effectively, they had relations. And the way the Arabs very much stayed. They did have relations through the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, almost an isolationism. Yeah. That by the time 1947-48 comes around, they're completely behind when it comes to dealing with the crisis, because they're completely out of their depth. They don't have the insight of the political world.
Yeah, Tom, I think that was a very interesting comment from you as well, very insightful, because whether you like him or not, David Ben-Gurion I personally view as a diplomatic master. He's very good at what Mr. Strother calls door wedge diplomacy, wherein he will get something that kind of just about benefits his cause, the cause of a Jewish state, and you just subtly compromise, and like a door wedge, you get the thin end of the wedge in the door first, and then you can gently prise it open from there. And we can see that with Resolution 181. I mean, of course, in David Ben-Gurion's party kind of charter, it says this idea of having Israel from the river to the sea, from the is it Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Yeah, and of course, whilst UN Resolution 181 did not guarantee that, he viewed it as this kind of door wedge in that getting a state. If you have a state, then you can obviously expand, and then you can end up slowly advancing towards your goal. Whereas the Arabs, on the other hand, are very kind of short-sighted in this way. They don't really want to make any concessions. I mean, of course, if you get into the Arab psyche, you can understand why. But from a kind of broad political standpoint, it's kind of difficult. There's no nuance. They're not willing to negotiate with UNSCOP, and even something that's often touted by a lot of kind of pro-Israeli figures today is that there was never a Palestinian state. I mean, it was offered to the Palestinians in UN Resolution 181, but because of this lack of wanting concessions and lack of ability to engage in this diplomacy, they rejected this Palestinian state and went to war. Leo?
I think it's also very important to recognise that there were a number of very public events that definitely swing diplomatic favour in the side of the Jews. One such of these instances was the Exodus ship during 1947, and in this, 4,500 Jewish refugees, many of them were former inmates of Nazi concentration camps, sailed from the south of France, were filmed by American newsreel cameras. However, the Royal Navy intercepted the ship and its passengers and landed them in Haifa, but then amid the glare of, the publicity, the American newsreels declared that they should be sent back to Germany in dislocated persons camps. And they declared a hunger strike, and the British authorities really doubled down on this. And within this, protests would erupt both sides of the Atlantic, and this swung public favour strongly in favour of the Jews. Not only had the Holocaust taken place, of course, and that gave an incredible amount of sympathy, but furthermore, you had events such as these further swinging reputation in favour of the Jews and away from Britain, and it would play a massive role, undisputably, really, in the eventual recognition of the Jewish state.
Yes, so I'm glad you've mentioned reputation, because, of course, reputation is very important for things like voting, and now we're going to get on to Resolution 181 and the kind of practicalities of it. So, does anyone want to talk about it?
Yeah.
Go on.
So, of course, the big points is that I think I'll do a bit backwards where, of course, from the modern view, we see Palestine as basically the West Bank and Gaza. At this point, we see much bigger chunks, of course, of almost the entirety of the West Bank being under Arab control, as well as further areas around the area that would become Gaza. Most importantly, of course, is that the area of Jerusalem, where of three, of course, the holy sites for the Abrahamic religions, that would have become international territory, governed by the UN. And, of course, Tel Aviv-Yafa, one of the big population zones, of course, would be in Israel.
Yes. So, Ibrahim, did you want to say something? Go on.
So when we look at this, we can really see the extent of the diplomatic manoeuvres of the Jews here. No one had expected the sort of partition to pass. You had the Soviet Union, most people expect them to be against. You had most nations expect to support the Arabs, since they did have a more moral standing point about, not having people take over a territory.
Yeah, that's certainly a contentious statement. But
from their
It's
perspective.
the norm, but this is like in pretty not usual circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, from an international perspective, I can certainly see why you would say that. I mean, from a modern standpoint, again, I
obviously it's very different.
Yeah,
but at the time, it might be seen that way.
Special circumstances.
You've mentioned sorry, I'll let you finish. Sorry, but you mentioned the Soviet Union, but it's interesting to see kind of their motivations for it, because I wouldn't think in a communist state there's a big lobbying system, but I suppose we can only really theorise as to why. I mean, there's two main reasons that kind of leap out to me, which are, A, they want to kind of sow mischief in the area, because they know that with the introduction of a Jewish state, there will be obviously chaos ensuing, especially in the fact that there have been many wars beforehand and revolts and etc. by the Arab population of the region. Also, because a lot of the Jews, such as Ben-Gurion, were kind of more socialist leaning, so perhaps they could influence the Middle East with communism, which is what they obviously
I mean,
want to do
yeah,
in Stalin's
like
time.
Israel at the point was far more left-leaning than it is
Yes.
today.
Yes.
much
But
more, yeah.
it seemed the Soviet Union, they always spread their influence when there was chaos, like in Vietnam or in other areas. So it seemed like that was another reason. By creating instability, they could spread their influence. But through lobbying mainly in the US is where they were able to sort of pressure other nations to accept the partition. And I think because of that rise in the US and the fall in the power of other nations, it was sort of a specific time where the Jews could really press it, especially with the Holocaust happening earlier. So it was almost like everything was in line for them to take over.
Leo?
One thing that really just cannot be overshadowed here is it must be recognised that on this issue, the United States of America and the Soviet Union ultimately voted together in this issue. Now, this was 1947. There was much contention between the two. I mean, we're less than a year away from the Berlin blockade, but still, the Jews would manage to get for the Soviet Union and United States, the world's two premier superpowers, to vote together on this issue, and that cannot be understated by any metric, really.
Yeah.
Right, yes. So, of course, UN Resolution 181 kind of led to the conclusion of the British mandate in what was then Palestine. Now, the state of Israel was declared independent on May the 14th, I believe, because the British left on the 15th. And, of course, ensuing, we have the civil war, where Jamal Hussein, who was the leader of the Arab Committee and their representative to the United Nations, said there would be nothing but a line of fire and blood, and that the Palestinians would fight for every inch of their country and drench the soil of their beloved country to the last drop of blood. Now, of course, these are very emotive statements, and I want to get on to the civil war between them. So does anyone want to talk about the 1948 civil war, as Israel calls their war of independence? Anyone? Really? Right. Okay, so when the UN declared this resolution, the United Resistance, which is what the combined force of the Irgun, the Stern Gang and the Haganah, who were the kind of underground military forces in Israel. I hope I pronounced that right. Unfortunately, Sam Dobkin isn't here to correct my pronunciation. But essentially, they had a plan called Plan D, which was essentially to just storm the strategic cities as quickly as possible in order to stamp out Arab resistance, because of course when you try to go through the rural countryside it's much more difficult, and also the power is concentrated in the city, because they saw in the 1936 revolts that tracking the Arabs through the countryside is far less efficient. But something that came with this is kind of a very unfortunate consequence. I say unfortunate. It's called by the Arab Palestinians as the Nakba, which roughly translates to catastrophe, and was what many describe as an ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Arabs, who were around half of the Palestinian population.
And 15,000 died.
Yes, 15,000 died from the cities and indeed the towns and villages, etc., of the region. Now, does anyone want to talk about the Nakba? Go on, Ibn.
So when you look at this situation here in the Nakba, you had that context of many Jews coming into the country, and the Jews attempt to create an Israeli state, and they do so. They ethnically cleanse hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, kill even more, and because you have that terror spreading throughout the region, you have Palestinians leaving themselves, and they go to Lebanon and Jordan, which causes instability. And you start to see you have the Arab countries preparing for war eventually, and you have when they invade, you can see that then when they do invade, they're not really trying to create a Palestinian state. They're really trying to
Stop an Israeli state.
Stop an Israeli state, because they're worried that terror is going to spread into their own country and affect their own diplomatic standings. But the Nakba is really a traumatic event in the psyche of the Arabs.
Yeah, just to note, I mean, the start of that war, it started by an event in a town called Deir Yassin, where around 100 to 254, the number's kind of disputed, Israelis killed Arabs were killed by Israelis, and this encouraged the other Arab states to invade because they saw the kind of their need to protect the Palestinian Arabs from the state of Israel. I mean, Tom, you wanted to add something?
Well, just on that specific point, though, I'd like to point out they also then retaliated. I think they killed 77 medics in a medical convoy, which they said was a direct response to, is it Deir Yassin?
Yes.
But just on the 1948 war, I'd like to point out that it was actually that Palestine was never really its own state with independence since that point, and instead it was merely an occupied zone of Transjordan and Egypt, which was merely kind of as a buffer to the expansion of the Jewish Israel.
Yeah. Leo?
Sorry, just before we move completely off the Nakba, we alighted upon its trauma, but it really would be important to state just how much of a traumatic event it was. 15,000 Palestinian Arabs were killed and 750,000 were forced to expel, and many villages were destroyed, burned, or given new Hebrew names, and biological warfare was actually waged on quite a large scale through the poisoning of village wells and other water sources, and a large amount of attacks on these Palestinian Arabs can be put under the bracket of ethnic cleansing, forced displacement, dispossession, mass killing, settler colonialism, and biological warfare. So this truly was a very traumatic event indeed.
Well, there was a typhoid outbreak in one of the cities affected, city or town, I'm not quite sure. It's called Acre, spelled like the English word acre. Acre, right? Yeah, there was a typhoid outbreak there, and it's added to a long list of towns and cities that were depopulated by the Israeli army during this war, such as Tiberias, Haifa, West Jerusalem, Safed, and Jaffa, and these. Well, some of these towns that were depopulated were, like Leo said, given Hebrew names to kind of erase the memory of Palestinians even living there. And also in the summer of 1948, Israel began implementing anti-repatriation policies to prevent the return of Palestinians to their homes, which is something that's actually still in effect today. There's not a right of return, which is something that also irks a lot. I say irks is probably not even a strong enough word. It really worries a lot of people who are on the pro-Palestinian side of this kind of debate, and yeah, like Leo said as well, none of the other Arab League states were interested in the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, like with Amin al-Husseini at its head. I mean, King Abdullah of Jordan, nor the British, nor any of the other ones really wanted an independent Palestinian state. They just didn't want Israel to be there. They wanted a kind of status quo, which just wasn't going to happen, as we've elated upon, because of the kind of unprecedented events of things like the Holocaust and, of course, the UN's involvement. Abraham?
I mean, to build on that, the Arabs, they talk about driving all the Jews to the sea at the time, and that really turns international opinion against them when we get to the war. I mean, I don't want to completely bash the Arabs. When we look at identity in the region, there really isn't a Palestinian identity building up until you get till the end of the mandate, and that's really in retaliation to the Israeli one. So it's not like they were essentially against the identity of the people, but they were afraid essentially of what the Israeli state might do. Although the Israeli state, they had attempt to be conciliatory. When we get to this war, we do see mass destruction.
Yeah, I mean, fear is definitely quite an interesting thing to point to, because during the Nakba, not all of it was actually done by force, the displacement. I mean, part of it was just this kind of, like Hashim said, I mean, this fear that the Israelis were going to come into their village and destroy it, and they just left to other Arab territories, or even areas such as Gaza and the West Bank that we see today. Now, I'd like to draw this certainly sobering episode of 21 Minutes in the Past to an end. But I'd like to say, on behalf of the team, I think whilst it's been incredibly kind of test of our humanity to talk about this kind of thing, I think it's been very interesting to research. I don't know, do you all agree?
Yeah, for sure. Certainly a brutal period of history.
But
yeah.
That's relevant.
Ultimately, history is a study of people, and people ultimately are